because here's the mean conduit size, how big that vessel is versus all of these species. And we see that the plant doesn't get into trouble until you get a conduit about 40 micrometers in diameter. Okay. You remember these two plants? One of these is greater than 40 micrometer diameter conduits. Very efficient in water transport. Which one do you think it is? Which one has the big conduits? Boy, what a student. Which one do you think is very susceptible to freezing? Got melasma lorina. -6, it's gone. This guy, 20 micrometers. Vessels can handle it. Unfortunately, the leaves, they drop out, they die at -9. But don't worry, there are other Ceanothus species. There's 70 species out there that can handle the cold temperature. So you're looking at that diversity, and in restoration, we have to be aware of all those factors. Okay, so let's go through a comparison of extremes. Here's Ceanothus on the left, and our melasma on the right. One on the left can withstand water stress to -11, right -3. Temperature -18, right -6. Roots less than 2 meters, greater than 10 meters. Non-sprouter, oligocedar, vigorous sprouter. Xylem is safe against water stress and freezing. That one's not safe at all, but it has an advantage. It is efficient. 5 times the efficiency of water transport. So it looks like that there's great diversity out there. And the question is, these are just 2 species. What about the rest of the chaparral community? So here are 22 species in the Santa Monica Mountains, and this is our percent loss to conductivity. No problem here, 100% inclusion. And notice, you can just take the minimum water potential, our scale of 0 to -10, and you can measure minimum seasonal water potential, and you can predict susceptibility to cavitation and susceptibility to water stress. So if you look at mean vessel diameter, it doesn't correlate quite as well, but recall we got a problem with this 40 micrometer diameter. That's where freezing kicks in, and it gives complexity. So looking at those overlaps are important. Okay, so one of the simple questions is, why are all chaparral shrubs incredibly drought tolerant, incredibly resistant to water stress and cavitation, and resistant to freezing? Economic theory says it may cost you something. It may be costly construction. You have to invest cellulose and lignin in order to withstand these stressful conditions. In contrast, this one's cheap, you get a root way down there, very efficient, big leaves, etc., etc. And yet there's great diversity out there when it comes to restoration, being aware of that is important. So how do you measure this investment? We measured the mechanical strength. Here's a stem. We measure by 4-point bending. We can measure the modulus of elasticity, how stiff the stem is by this initial slope. We can measure the breaking point, the modulus of rupture, by this max. This is basically flexural load, newtons, flexural extension in millimeters. And we can do things like just measure wood density and predict susceptibility to cavitation in woods. We can measure things like branch strength, how easy it is to break in the water, and predict susceptibility to cavitation in woods. We can even go in and look at the cells and measure the cell wall thickness and the diameter. And we can predict whether the cells are. So this investment looks like it. Okay, what I'm going to do now is, I think I want to maximize the time for questions. And so what I'm going to do is John did a real good job of covering the fire ecology. So don't worry, this is mainly fire ecology and how it interrelates. What I'm going to do is go to the summary slide, and then I'll open for questions. Maximize time for questions.
We have 25 questions after both of you.
Did you want me to go through this?
You have plenty of time.
Make your decision.
Okay, I'll tell you what. I'm going to go through, let me go through just a couple of things here. and I'll do this pretty quick. Because I do want to say that, you know, John's focus on fire is really important. And I know there's a little overlap here, but I just want to mention this. We had a fire, 6th July 2006 here at Sherwood Lake in the Santa Monica Mountains. About the same time, we had a fire right here at Catalina, which is really rare. And then we had the worst drought in recorded history, 2007, remember? So how do these plants recover after fire? And so here's the Catalina recovery. And I predict, this is Aaron Ramirez, and we had Catalina Conservancy set up deer exposure, so these exotic deer couldn't get in and chew on these reed sprouts. And this is Heteromys angustifolia. So here's inside the fence, deer can't get to it. Here's outside the fence, deer can get to it. Do you see a difference? Okay, and these don't belong on Catalina Island, they were brought in. And so I predicted this extreme drought. They're going to die due to cavitation of the bias. But the data didn't end up supporting that. The other hypothesis is that this big root down below the surface is respiring down there, and it can use some carbon. It's like potato, but it's rapid growth, and pretty soon it'll deplete its carbon and will die due to carbon starvation. And so here is the resprout. Here it's outside and inside. You can see the difference. And after a few months, they started dying in high numbers. And we see the mortality in outside the exclosure was over 90% mortality. Inside the exclosure, there was a little mortality and much. As far as the height of the plant outside the exclosure, much taller than those inside the exclosure. And we didn't think it was xylem embolism because these resprouts, the water potential didn't even get down to the turtle loss point. And even at midday, they barely touched the turtle loss point, but nowhere close to 50% cavitation and embolism. What we think was going on was carbon starvation. Here's Brandon Pratt extracting core out of the root, looking at carbohydrate content. And you see the adults that weren't burned at pretty high carbohydrate content, where the ones outside are intermediate, and the ones inside are intermediate, the ones outside are the lowest. So we think it's carbohydrate. Okay, and lastly, this is the other fire location. Same time, extreme drought after the fire. And these are the species. Melasma lorina, here's one we haven't talked about. Adenosum fasciculatum, those dead reed sprouts alive. Spinosus, dead reed sprout. Heteromys angustifolia, dead and alive reed sprouts. And in this case, we found that there was a pretty high mortality of reed sprouts. Here's Adenosum fasciculatum, Ceanothus spinosus. And this is the important data, post-fire resprout survival. And what we see is both the Adenosum fasciculatum chemise had high mortality. The Ceanothus spinosus had high mortality, around 70 to 80%. Our Heteromys angustifolia was sort of intermediate, about 40% mortality. And that was due to drought-induced, not carbon starvation. And here you can see our little Ceanothus out there competing with the grasses after the fire. And the bottom line is, out of all 7 species, all of them are declining, so they aren't replacing the pre-fire community structure, with the exception of this guy right here. This Ceanothus has very high seeding survival, good recruitment, so it's doing pretty good. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to the summary slide. As far as restoration of chaparral, I think as far as biological considerations, I'd like to point out that there's great biodiversity out there. There's a different seasonal water status. There are different rooting depths. There's different susceptibility to cavitation. There's different wood density and mechanical strength. And this is the fiber cost to prevent implosion and to give structural support for drought tolerance that are between non-sprouting species and sprouters. As far as wildfire, there are some that are non-sprouters, some that are facultative sprouters, others that are obligate sprouters, and there are different strategies of recovering after fire. You gotta look at both the resprouts, the seedlings, and adults. And lastly, freezing is a function of vessel diameter, susceptibility of the leaves to freezing, and of course the interactions that you talked about, drought and freezing. Okay, thank you very much. So I think we have 5 minutes, is that right?
No, we got like 25.
Okay. Well, the more the merrier. I just got 5 for me.
5 for you.
Yeah.
5 directly for you.
Yeah, sorry I went over 5 minutes, but
Well, we'll have to have time for more discussion. Do we have any questions?
Where were you good? Yeah.
oh no, I know there are questions out there. Yeah,
Like this, I'll give you this, just don't cough directly.
Since I live in Old Chaparral, I'm very interested in what you were doing because it seems to be the combination of fire and drought that causes the most problems for the Chaparral because from what I've seen in fire, post-fire, is that Ceanothus spinosus does quite well. It sprouts very well, and I've seen it actually get so old it fell over and resprouted from its roots. So to me, what it looks like is if you were going to restore any chaparral community of this sort, you would have to have a species of every single one of these different varieties because each one has a different approach to survival. What do you think about that?
yeah, I think you need to, when you're looking at complex community structure, mixed chaparral, you have to take into account the different species present. Now, what you can do is break it down into functional groups. And that's what I would recommend, maybe the functional groups to simplify it because it could be complex otherwise. Let me just mention the Ceanothus spinosus. We've done post-fire recovery of Ceanothus spinosus. The seedlings don't do really well, about 10% survival, but the resprouts characteristically have about 30% mortality 3 or 4 years out. After the severe drought, it was pretty close. It was almost 80% mortality. So this is different. This is new. And that's what extreme drought does, even to resprouts that have this root intact and normal mechanisms of recovery, but they haven't seen these kind of severe droughts. So even spinosus has problems, and the data shows it's not going to replace the original stand structure. So.
No, and I know you have quite a few tests to show it doesn't. But on all your graphs, you had Melasma lorina one part, and Ceanothus megatarpus the other part, and then halfway in between was the Ceanothus spinosus, which tells me that if you had measured more and more plants, you'd probably have this whole spectrum of approaches to handling catastrophes and climate change. So my feeling is that in any restoration of chaparral, you cannot rely on just a few species. But I think this is great. I really thank you very much for your information because you're right in the spot where things are happening in a definite set of circumstances. And the other thing I want to mention is fog. Everybody seems to forget fog, but coastal fog makes quite a bit of difference to a lot of these plants. We may not have much rain, but if you do still have the coastal fog, I see plants responding to it and continuing on fairly well. Have you ever measured that?
We haven't measured fog, and certainly it's a possibility UC Berkeley has done that with redwoods, but I don't think they've done a chaparral. Yeah, we don't know.
Thank you. Will the establishment of one chaparral species in the future aid other chaparral and natives to come back?
Yeah, I think so. Some of the data I didn't show you, we did common garden studies, and what happens is we think seedling establishment is really important because that's where the stresses are among the greatest. The roots have not developed yet, and if you establish you're gonna make it there, likely. But, Ceanothus megacarpus, it has high mortality in shade. It needs that open canopy from our common, garden studies where we impose shade. In contrast, Melasma rhina, the seedlings that you saw, have really high mortality and they do well in the shade. And so it's sort of like you can prepare the way for other, facilitate establishment. You can be a nurse plant, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, yeah, I think that'd be well worth investigating. I kind of skipped over that. In addition, I didn't mention what I call obligate sprouters after fire. Their seeds are killed by fire, so the seedlings only germinate and establish between fire. And so the seedlings establish in deep shade. And so they're very different than the other two. So taking that into account. And when I said about taking functional traits, you can just say, well, there are 3 functional traits: non-sprouters, facultative sprouters, obligate sprouters. And that will help simplify if you're overwhelmed with all the species. And I agree, all the species are important. But at the initial cut, you may want to simplify in categories.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention relative to Becky's question, there is a paper that was done just last year on looking at chaparral physiology relative to fall gradients. A dissertation at UC Santa Cruz, and it was published in Roche last summer. But there are distinct differences in water relations of chaparral as you move from the coast to the interior.
Oh.
Like bases.
It might be. I've forgotten about that. I actually was involved in it. Forgot.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's really embarrassing. I let Brandon and Anna handle that one.
There was also on Catalina Island, they studied fog dynamics with the Pacific, or the Crocus Pacific, and found that it wasn't using fog much in its water relations. It was accessing deeper groundwater. So I think it would probably, like you said, vary depending on the root system, where they're accessing deep groundwater or not.
Okay, thank you. I like a group like this with all this expertise. They can remind me of things I'm supposed to know. Yeah.
I'm just interesting, the first time I've ever seen anyone talk about the freeze factor in chaparral.
So why is that, you think? Why do you think I'm the first time you ever heard of it?
I don't know. I've heard elevation, and so I was my question is, how does elevation, and obviously the correlation between freezing and elevation is a pretty direct correlation, but because you're right on the coast, it surprises me that that the freeze factor is still such a huge factor, even right on the coast there.
Yeah, no, I was kind of kidding a little bit. It's obviously more on freezing. Chaparral doesn't seem logical.
Right.
So basically, we know that the thicker the atmosphere, the warmer it is. And as you go up in elevation, it gets colder and colder. That's called the lapse rate. And the lapse rate is about 1 degree for every 1,000 meters, or 1,000 meters. So what happens is, in our case, you're in these deep canyons, it's shaded, and there's air that's denser and it drains down into these areas, and then you're moving away from the ocean, so it's getting cooler. And so the lapse rate there is about 5 to 10 times steeper, the wrong direction. And we've actually published 7 or 8 papers on this phenomenon, but it's really hard to get anyone's attention, especially in this funding agency. We've tried that. And it's because you can't get over the first sentence, it's not too moron. So, but I think, really, I think if you want to look at things like freezing tolerance, etc., you don't want to go to Alaska or Antarctica. What you want is to be on the edge. That's where evolution, that's where natural selection, that's where these physiological processes are being worked out. So number one. Number two, it's just undeniable. I've fought this. I mean, why are plants distributed where they are? And the thing is, I can walk out through the Santa Monica Mountains, and I know where these things freeze, and I can tell when they're going to shift species. So I use it as a powerful tool. And so I know it's real. And but it's mainly, I call it cold air drainage, or other terms for it, radiation freezing. But it's real in the Santa Monica. So I think, boy, I ought to continue to look for it. And all of these Ceanothus species, why so many species? Where are these little niches? Well, I'm telling you, if you die, because you can't handle that cold night, you're not going to be there. And we actually have one paper where we show them dying. The fluorescence goes to 0, they're all dead, And the seeds washed down after fire, and there they are in the valley, but they all died in the valley. And the reviewer sort of says, well, why do you have that in? We should take that out. That's everything. Establishment's everything. So I think we need to don't give in, but to be open to the possibilities, including fog. We just haven't looked at it personally.
Yeah, Steve, do we, one more.
One.
Steve, do you have any idea what's going on with Shanice? Because it's almost ubiquitous in California, but it drops out of the chaparral in the interior part of the Sierra Nevada. It's not even in the eastern part of the state. And then, like the southern Sierra Nevada, it drops out at about 2,000 feet, even though chaparral is up quite a bit higher. And I remember a long time ago, Walt Westman did some climate diagrams of chaparral species, and the winter temperatures for Shanice were always quite a bit higher than they were for things like sea levels in the 80s, which makes it very cold. Do you know what it is that's limited them?
No, I don't, and we haven't looked at Shanice. And that's a great question. And the thing that really concerns me in some ways, why aren't these cold tolerant species growing up there in the warm areas? It's kind of the reverse. Okay, I know why Cenos megacarpus, Cenos spinosus, a lot of them do not grow in the cold valleys. But why do the species there not invading the coast? So it goes both ways, and I don't know the answer to that one either. So sorry, I don't. We haven't looked at Shanice. That'd be a good thing to look at.
And it
Because
probably
these are really
relates-
small.
Probably relates to why Shanice is one of the few chaparral species that doesn't get into Arizona chaparral. Because it beats the half dozen California chaparral species that are quite common in parts of Arizona. Shanice is one.
Yeah, and if you go to Northern California, correct me if I'm, if you get to the west, you do see quite a bit of Shanice
Oh, yeah.
down coastal. So it all fits.
But
Yeah.
in the interior,
Thank you so much.
So that was a great introduction. So John, we're going to ask you to come up to the front as well. And the two of you can grab, there are actually seats there. And what we would like to do now is to have about a 20-minute discussion. And what we want to remind you is what the focus area was for this session, which was sort of broad scale thinking about biological and landscape level factors and sort of the background of the current situation in Chaparral. We have two experts up here. And actually, it would be fine if you guys wanted to have a dialogue between yourselves as well, which you've been doing, which is fantastic. But I would welcome, or it could be fantastic. I would welcome those of you in the audience to think about what you want to ask these two guys, or what sort of discussion you want to get going with respect to restoration practice, implementation, theory, etc. And let's do this, because this is the whole point of this meeting. It's not to sit here and start falling asleep after 30 minutes of the presentation because you just had lunch. It's to be active and to ask what you want to ask and do it. We've got some smart people in the room, and we've got 20 to 25-minute sessions after every one of these sections. So let's use it. Who wants to start? All right. Hey, speak loudly. I won't give this to you. That's fine.
I have a question specific to Shanice because I have some on property that I manage. And the question isn't so much restoration as it is management. I want to leave the Shanice, but I would like for it to be a little bit more, it's got a pretty good pool around it. I'd like to turn it up, I'd like to make it a little bit more fire safe. Do you work with Shanice in that way, or the things I should do, shouldn't do? Should I just cut it down? Let it grow back?
well, I
Or
think
should try
fire
to-
safe and Shanice are terms that shouldn't be used.
I agree with you, but I also don't want to clear cut this piece of property. Whether it's realistic or not, I would like to be able to think that we could actually walk across it, sort of like a nature trail, and not just be looking at, that's where the brush was before I cleared it.
Well, I don't think it's a situation where you have to clear it. For example, there's a really nice study done, actually by some people out of Cleveland, I think, where they were modeling the extent of fuel reduction that had to be done in order to produce defensible space around homes. And I think their conclusion was as long as there was 30% clearance between the shrubs, that it produced tolerable defensive space. And so it was not a matter of having cleared, it was just a matter of having to create enough gaps between shrubs to prevent fire spread. So So it does sound feasible that you can keep things like chamise in the stand, and I would guess the important thing is not as much trimming up the chamise as it is making sure there's sufficient gaps between shrubs to prevent fire spread. But of course, you know, trimming it up and cutting out the dead wood, because chamise is one of those species that accumulates a lot of dead wood and doesn't drop it. So I'm sure that would help.
Can you express 30% in a different way?
70% cover?
I was looking for spatial, you know, like how many.
Oh, how many feet between shrubs?
Yeah,
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not really sure.
okay. Well,
But I mean, I have a picture of what they were talking about, and they were talking about stands where maybe there were 10 feet between shrubs, something like that.
Okay, okay.
But if you're interested in the report, I have a PDF of it that I'd be happy to send it to you if you send me an email.
I'd like to hear more discussion about pre-fire fuel management versus post-fire survivability. Yeah, this is the focus.
Pre-fire fuel treatment versus,
Successful survival of the chaparral applicants.
well, that's kind of a loaded question.
Can you repeat the question?
The question had to do with the relationship of fuel treatments and post-fire recovery of chaparral. Is that? We don't really have a lot of data on this. The bottom line is when you're doing fuel treatments, you potentially are manipulating the system so that it may not recover. And we'll have a little bit of data on this from the study we're doing now on mastication, but there isn't really a lot of good study looking at the potential for recovery after a fire of fuel-treated versus non-fuel treated areas. There is the goal in some fuel treatments that all you're doing is creating a younger seral stage chaparral and it'll continue on its trajectory after fires of recovery, but we really don't have data to support that belief. I've seen masticated sites where the chamise chaparral seems to be recovering just fine and probably will sustain itself in the face of fire. And so when it comes to chamise, I don't think that fuel treatments necessarily are going to alter the system in the long run. But when it comes to restoration, we're not talking about revegetating the site. We're talking about maintaining the community. And there, I think, there is the potential fuel treatments alter the community composition in ways that it is not going to return to anything resembling a natural system. But once again, we don't have a lot of data on that. This is sort of my gut feeling. Tess is working up data now, and potentially in another year we'll have a little bit more data on the role of mastication. We have some masticated sites that burned. We'll be able to address that a little bit more. The one thing I do know is this site where she was studying, where the masticator ignited a fire, so we compared the post-fire site with the masticated site. There are clear compositional differences. Certain species, like Dicentra, which is a strict pyro-endemic, it only comes up after fire, wasn't in the masticated sites. The masticated sites tended to be dominated by non-native alien species, at least in terms of the herbaceous component. The burn site had very few non-native alien species. So we do know that treatments, mastication treatments, for example, are going to change composition. You're not going to have the same community. I think that it's important to realize when it comes to any fuel treatment in this type of system, and it doesn't apply necessarily to conifer systems, but in non-forested systems like chaparral, I think we need to think of fuel treatments as resource sacrifice. We're modifying the resource, and that doesn't mean you don't do it. It just means you recognize that there's a sacrifice in terms of resources, And what I would hope is if there is a sacrifice in resources, then you're sure of the benefits of that treatment. Because you would hope that treatments would be a little more prudent if you know that there is some cost to doing it. But that's what we really need to understand better is what are the costs and benefits. You know, a lot of field treatments are done. We don't really have a good clear understanding of what the benefits are. And we don't have a good understanding of the costs. So there's a lot that needs to be done along that line.
There was a question here in the middle. I just wanted to note that you have to remember that we do fuels treatment so it doesn't recover to what it was before. And that's really important point that you finished on. I mean, really important.
But that,
these are the kind of
that
decisions
depends on,
we need to
that
make.
depends on the fuel specialist you're talking to.
Well, yeah.
We talked to, you know, when we started the mastication study, we had workshops with all the forests and the fuels and resource specialists. And on some of the forests, you know, all of the forests, we said, well, what's your goal? Some of the forests, the goal was to maintain chaparral in a young cirral stage. Other forests were very candid. They said, our goal is to type convert chaparral to grassland. And I had to applaud them for their candor because that is what happens. But there is the belief that you can do fuel treatments and maintain chaparral in a young cirral stage. And I think that's true for some of the species in chaparral. Whether you maintain the whole community, I doubt it.
There was a question in the middle, I don't know.
Yeah, going back to the biological considerations, wondering if you've looked at or anyone else has looked at the variability within a species for drought tolerance and freezing tolerance, things like that, and how important
I'm sorry, the variability of what species?
within any species, do those things change, and is that anything? Has that work been done?
We've done a few comparisons. For example, we're using this indicator of susceptibility to cavitation and embolism, and it does vary with elevation, and it does vary with coastal to inland. And several other labs have seen the same, but we haven't done an extensive study. So there is variation within that parameter that we measure. And you would assume that being the case of the way genetics are. Right now, Aaron Ramirez, I showed you the picture, he's working on his PhD at UC Berkeley, is still working on the island system, Catalina Island. And what's interesting is it's more hydrated on the island, the soil's higher, there's more fog effect, etc. But their vulnerability to cavitation is very similar to the mainland, so that surprised us.
There's a question right in front here. Please raise your hand if you have one coming up, and then I'll drop the mic.
Hi, we've observed two species of manzanita in North San Diego County that burned in 2007, Glauca and Xylococcus. Both seed sprouting prolifically, like maybe up to 24 new plants per parent plant. But they're still little, 5-6 years later. Are they more than a year old? And what's the prognosis of a plant with that many new seed sprouts?
Well, Arctocephalus glauca seedlings are very drought tolerant, and my guess is, even though they're very small, this period of time after fire, they very certainly came right after the fire in the first year. Usually you don't get recruitment after that. And that I would expect that they have a high probability of surviving. They're very drought tolerant. Xylococcus, on the other hand, I have seen one Xylococcus seedling in my life. I've never seen them. They do not seem to produce seedlings after fire. Now, Rick Halsey, he has seen Xylococcus seedlings, but not after a fire, underneath the shrubs. And they didn't survive more than a year. Whenever I've seen Xylococcus in the field, it's always been resprouts, not seedlings.
Okay, you're probably right.
And the resprouts will persist, you know, very well, because Xylococcus, I would imagine, has very deep root systems.
Can I make a comment on that? Is Arctocephalus glauca?
Yes.
I took it out of the presentation, but this totally shocked me, because you can tell when I get into something, I'm biased that way, and then usually my predictions wrong. Very humbling to be a scientist. So we were really onto this cavitation and embolism, predicting drought tolerance. And we were doing it with seedlings and with resprouts. And then in the drought of 2002, there were massive kill over the Sonoran Desert. It's between San Jacinto and Santa Rosa Creek. And so we did community structure of what was preferentially dying. And the most resistant to cavitation and embolism in the adult form were dying. And that was Arctostaphylos glauca, about 80% mortality of the adults due to that extreme drought event. The other was Ceanothus greggii, also very resistant to cavitation and embolism. Now, what was characteristic of those two species? They're both obligate seeders, non-sprouters, and they both have shallow roots. And I'm convinced, well, we were convinced by that one data set, that in the adult stage, it's a different story than in the seedling and the resprout. And in the adult stage, rooting depth under severe drought trumps everything. And so if we have severe drought effects, you can have some surprises, especially with an adult. And so anyway, 80% mortality, glauca is about 8%, Ceanothus greggii, and the others are like 10 to 20% mortality.
Question up front.
Yeah, Steve, about the island fire in Catalina, it's pretty exciting post-fire recovery because there were seeds apparently in the seed bank that had been there for 100 years or more. And a lot of us, I guess, are pretty upset about the deer coming in and Fish and Wildlife didn't particularly go in the direction we wanted. And I'm just wondering, in the areas that were not exposed, what do you see the recovery as? Because from our perspective, from some casual observations, there's not a lot left there. So have you done any long-term studies on that, or are you going to, or?
John may know this better than I do. My two former students, Brandon and Anna, we kind of set the experiment up, but they're continuing to follow that, and they can answer that question because they're following it very carefully. But just over the phone and conversation with Brandon on this, there's heavy browsing outside the exposure versus inside, and we initially thought there's going to be really high mortality outside where the deer are browsing on the seedlings. But they're doing much better than we predicted. There is mortality, but not that much more than inside on the seedling. And we found this many years ago, maybe John has too, that on a seedling, the deer browse it down a certain level. And in some ways, you're removing leaf area and water loss area. And so those seedlings don't do all that bad just during the summer drought period. So there's surprises. It's more complicated than us ecologists would like it to be. But you'll have to check with either Brandon Pratt or Anna Jacobson, who have that data at hand.
Is that question right here? Oh, I'm sorry, you want to follow up and see what Sarah, you. You want the mic?
No, it's okay. So actually the recovery on the island fire of Catalina is actually, because it was a large fire, it sort of overwhelmed the herbivore population, and we also had really good rain the year after the fire, and so we saw a real difference between that fire and the fire that Dr. Davis talked about, that was very dry year after. So it really matters what happens the year after you've got herbivores.
Thank you, Sarah. I didn't know you were here. I would have called on you sooner.
Okay, great.
In terms of restoration, seems in my experience, there's no putting the plants back. It's really more about protecting it from some of the things we're talking about. We can't save it from drought, but we can save it from weeds, and we can save it from another fire. Do you see that our discussion is going to move into a different category, that there's things we can do to put plants back?
Well, it seems to me that you need to do both. The most cost-efficient approach is to keep chaparral intact and not allow it to be type converted. But there are, these disastrous events that happen, like on the Angeles and the Station Fire, where we lost a lot of big cone duck fir. And those, those have been lost, and they're a rare part of the flora, and so they do need to be put back. And I think it's the same with things like Kikani cypress. They're localized, small populations. When they get extirpated from a site, I think it's be critical to try and put them back. Now, to go into a very massive area and convert a grassland to chaparral, I'm convinced it could be done. It depends on how much money you have and how patient. Because I don't think it's a simple thing to do.
There was a question here.
So it was touched on in the introduction and in your talk about reference and defining that and the importance of it. And I'm sort of interested in thoughts on this because some of our fellow ecologists and restorationists on the aquatic side of things with streams and wetlands have been dealing with this concept for a generation, basically. And have come up with some good ways of saying, defining it qualitatively as least impacted or least disturbed, or using statistical techniques like non-metric multidimensional scaling, where you say, I have a probabilistically defined data set that probably spans the range of anthropogenic disturbance from very highly disturbed to least disturbed, and then extracting out disturbance gradients or metrics for assessing quality of the system or health of the system and so on. And again, the index of biotic integrity literature that, again, focuses heavily on the aquatic side, but they've wrestled with this concept for a long time. Being relatively new to California in the xeric chaparral system, I'm really interested to see anyone's thoughts on, this has been a system that's been disturbed in lots of ways for hundreds of years. But is there a sense that you could define a reference gradient of some sort of intact chaparral to not, gone, which is a sort of alien grassland?
Well, there are some restoration studies being done down, I know, in Orange County, Irvine Ranch Conservancy, and they're trying various models. And one of the models, they're primarily working on coastal sage growth, or excuse me, California sage growth near the coast. And the sage scrub there, they have a model that your goal should not to be to go out and replace the entire system at once. And the idea is to develop islands of shrubs within a matrix of invasives and whatnot. And then using passive management, those species will fill in and complete the process on their own. And certainly, if that works, it's a lot more economically feasible. The only downside of it is if you're working with islands of sage scrub or chaparral within the context of alien grasses, the probability of reburning is much higher because the alien grasses have a much longer fire season, very flammable most of the year. And in fact, as some work that Alex Seifert over here has shown, if you look at fire ignitions in chaparral systems, or just across our landscape, most of them start in herbaceous vegetation. Some of our worst chaparral fires, like the Esperanza fire, started in grasses, alien grasses. So that's a problem. If you're going to leave the alien grasses in and let the shrublands recover passively, you have that potential of another fire before they've actually recovered.
I think we have time for one more question. Kim, can you speak louder?
Yes, that actually leads right to my question, which, do you know how long it takes for the seedling of a re-sprouter to become capable of re-sprouting? I mean, scrub oaks are a special case, they've got a huge seed, they dump their contract to big growth, but how about the other re-sprouters? How old do they have to be able to withstand a fire that's carried, say, by the surrounding grasses?
Well, Steve, you looked at a lot of melasma, Varina seedlings.
Yeah, I guess they start, what I was surprised is, even in our common garden, they start producing a root crown the first year. So they're, we've seen, at our fire center, we studied for 20 years, we've seen some pretty small seedlings in Melasma marina actually re-sprout. So I think that's an exceptional plant. It allocates, if it survives, it'll allocate a lot to that root crown. I'm sure it varies to other species.
One of the primary limitations to regeneration in many of our obligate re-sprouters is it's like, as Steve pointed out, you know, their strategy is to have deep root systems and to persist through summer drought because they have access to water, because they haven't developed the physiological and morphological traits that allow them to resist drying conditions. The downside of that strategy is seedlings can't start off with a deep root system. And so they got to get over that hurdle of getting a deep root system. And from my experience, the only place that I've ever seen good populations of things like scrub oak and prunus and rhamnus is in mature chaparral, very mature chaparral, usually very old stands. And so they're not post-fire recruiters because post-fire environments are very stressful in terms of drought stress. Whereas in older stands with a developed litter layer, there is the potential that water conditions are a little bit better. And so they really regenerate a very different way. And it's always important to keep in mind, these things we call obligate resprouters applies to their response to fire. They do seed and they do recruit. It's just they don't recruit after fire. And it's probably because their seedlings are a very vulnerable stage to the drying conditions of fire, burn area. Would you want to argue with that, or?
No, I was just thinking, and there are always surprises. Actually, I brought one here that was kind of a question on the exam that some people do. This one right here I didn't show you, but this one's Rhamnus californica. And we had this one in our common garden, and it always did surprising things. It was actually pretty hardy. And it was one that would die back after the drought treatment and then sprout. And we didn't have any other species.
What about its freezing tolerance?
It's, we didn't measure it, but it's pretty cold tolerant.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then now you know it's renamed from Rhamnus to Frangula. So it's an odd one, but it's out there in the mixed chaparral. So there are always surprises with their ability to sprout. This one's really, to answer Kim's question, this one here is surprisingly good to resprout even the first year and even after apparently dying what we thought was death due to drought.
And these ones that are freeze tolerant, like the Rhamnus and Ceanothus cuneatus, these tend to be the most widespread chaparral, getting far outside of California, like Frangula californica gets all the way down almost to Mexico City and is quite common in the Arizona chaparral. And so these things that are freezing tolerant appear to be very widespread. I interpret them as probably species that comprise probably the earliest tertiary chaparral remnants, most of which we think probably were in the Southwest somewhere. Problem is we don't have any tertiary floras from the Southwest, so we can't really test that.
Okay, well, it is break time. I want to give these guys a big hand. So you probably have figured this out, but for some reason they have the clock here on bar time. So